Sisters and brothers, prepare yourselves. What we have searched for so long, we now will see. Please, beg the glorious human visitors to enter.
Hey, this is David Clayman doing the video review for Advent Rising for IGN Xbox. Advent Rising is the first game in the epic trilogy for Xbox. It's a sci-fi based game and it had dialogue co-written by Orson Scott Card. First thing to talk about with Advent Rising is the story. I thought the story turned out really well. Unlike many people thought in the beginning, Orson Scott Card didn't write the story, he co-wrote the dialogue, but this doesn't take away from the fact that it is a great sci-fi story. In fact, I would rank this story probably closer to sci-fi literature in terms of quality than I would to a typical video game. Usually in video games you have a main character who has to kill all of the bad guys. You know, in Halo you're the Master Chief and you have to kill the Covenant, and that's really as much as you need to know. This story has some political intrigue, it has characters, the characters develop as the story progresses. You're going to have death, you're going to have love, the character has a fiancé and a brother that he cares very deeply about. So it has all the things that you'd find in a typical sci-fi novel that are really interesting. The next thing to talk about, what everybody's been talking about Advent Rising, are its technical failings. It's even been slightly controversial. The game's been slammed in a few reviews because it just doesn't technically stand up to what we come to expect on Xbox. From my point of view, this is really the only main problem with the game, is that it technically doesn't achieve what it set out to. Of course, you have to give credit to Glyphix, a small developer, for having these grandiose ideas, putting massive worlds and massive amounts of enemies on the screen at the same time with powers, weapons, dual wielding, and all these other technical achievements that they just weren't really able to employ at the end. When you look at how the gameplay functions in Advent Rising, the flick targeting, the powers, and the lock-on system, it really works very well, and in my opinion I feel like the environments could have been scaled back almost by 30 to 50% and possibly the same with the number of enemies on screen, and the game still would have been fun. This really brings up the question, was it necessary for so much to be crammed in onto the screen at the same time, causing the frame rate to drop? I think that if the environments had been scaled back and the number of enemies had been lessened in order for the frame rate to run at a solid 30 frames per second at least, that this game really would have received a much higher score across all of the review sites. And therein lies a slight contradiction with Advent Rising, because you can actually ignore some of the frame rate issues and take the same amount of enjoyment away from the gameplay. The thing about flick targeting is that it allows you to lock on to one enemy at a time, so even if the frame rate drops, you never stop firing at your intended target. Therefore, I was able to ignore some of the frame rate issues and still have a good time bouncing around the level, killing people, using all of my powers. Besides the frame rate issue, there was also some other technical failings. You had some areas where scripted events wouldn't occur, and you'd have to restart from save points in order to make them happen. For example, elevator doors wouldn't open or elevators wouldn't rise to get you to the next area. There's also some areas where the main character, Gideon Wyatt, would be stuck on corners, or one of his vehicles would be stuck behind walls. All these little things add up towards the end, but they never really became overly frustrating due to the fact that there's a huge number of save points and checkpoints throughout the game, so you may have to restart a few times as the story progresses. So these technical issues affect the game adversely, but what I really liked about the game was the combat. Even before you start getting your powers, you have a huge number of combat options. Gideon can dual-wield weapons, so using a Halo technique of holding down the X or Y button, you can put a gun in each hand. He also has grenades, he has a melee attack, he can dodge, which eventually becomes a slow-motion dodge, sort of like Max Payne. And then, as the game progresses and the storyline progresses, he begins to unlock these inhuman, but actually human powers. So, the first one of these powers you might recognize from PsyOps, or any other mental telepathy game, where you can lift objects and throw them at your enemies. All the powers can also be mapped to the trigger at any time, so using the D-pad you can map your weapons or your powers to either the left or right trigger, depending on what you feel more comfortable with. Eventually he gains a few more powers, he can shoot out sonic waves, he can fire projectiles, and towards the end of the game you might just be using completely powers and forget about weapons entirely. There's also a few bosses in the game, which I didn't mention in the written review, but I really enjoyed. Now, while there's only a few of them, they force you to use your powers in creative ways because they can't be beaten using normal weapons. This is something that a game that overpowers the main character really has to do to get players to look at all the aspects of combat. The majority of the game is spent in third-person combat, using your guns, using your powers to destroy the Seekers and kill enemies. However, there are a ton of scripted events that make this more engaging. For example, in one scene, your ship's falling through the atmosphere and parts of it fly off, shooting into space, and you have to be careful not to fly off into space along with them. There's also a secret tank that you get to jump into. This part's really fun because the tank is really overpowering and there's some huge explosions. You're pretty much invincible while you're piloting this vehicle, but it is interesting change up in gameplay. Another aspect of this game I really enjoyed was the music. There's a full orchestral arrangement along with a gospel choir and a children's choir that really adds to the drama in the game. Some of the scenes may seem corny until the music kicks in, which is really on par with a summer blockbuster arrangement rather than a video game arrangement. This is the type of the music that you're going to want to buy as a soundtrack or download on MP3, not something that you're going to want to turn down after playing a few times and replace with your own stereo music or a custom soundtrack. In closing, Advent Rising is a very ambitious game with a few technical failings that are really holding it back. It seems as though Glyphix may have overstepped their capabilities with everything that they wanted to do in this title, but I give them credit for trying. Advent Rising really breaks out of the mold of third-person action games, giving you a really powerful main character with a lot of combat options. In short, I'd say that this game is definitely worth a rental and possibly a purchase for those who are willing to overlook the graphical failings.
I'm sick of people dying for me. This ends now.